Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we are doing an absolutely essential analysis. We're taking a deep dive in a stack of critical sources that all address the state of modern cinematic, television narratives. And these sources, they offer a really sharp structural critique. They're asking a pretty fundamental question.
Yeah, a really big question.
What happens to the longevity and, the impact of a story when its narrative priorities shift so dramatically? I mean, specifically, what happens when we move away from ideas like objective morality and genuine accountability and instead focus almost exclusively on diverse representation and maximizing individual autonomy?
And that's the core tension we're exploring today, and it's a big one. The source material argues that Hollywood, in its pursuit of, certain contemporary values, has sort of inadvertently created a narrative vacuum.
A vacuum? That's a strong word.
It is. They claim that the push for what is often called progressive storytelling has sacrificed the very thing that makes heroes memorable. The authentic, inspirational character, the person who makes painful, self-sacrificing, and, genuinely virtuous choices.
Okay.
So our mission today is really to help you, the listener, understand this argument for why audiences are actually hungry for these classic virtuous heroes and what the cultural and even the commercial costs are when storytellers fail to deliver.
Okay, let's unpack this and jump right in. We'll start by dissecting the specific arguments for why this current progressive approach, according to the critique, often falls short of its own narrative goals. Then we're going to pivot and analyze the profound, enduring power you find in the counterexample story, where virtue is really the end plot.
Things like The Lord of the Rings.
Exactly. Lord of the Rings, the indomitable spirit you see in a film like Hacksaw Ridge, and the surprisingly deep emotional resonance of that recent global success, Godzilla minus.
Yeah, a lot to cover.
A lot to cover. So let's start with the hard-hitting critique.
So, the central claim opening our source material is that a significant number of contemporary writers and creators in general are approaching their craft from what the document explicitly calls a skin-deep point of view.
A skin-deep point of view. What does that mean exactly?
Well, it's both literal and figurative. It refers literally to outward identity markers, but figuratively it's pointing to a superficial narrative structure.
I think that's where the analysis gets immediately interesting. Because it's not just about who's on screen. It's about why they are on screen.
Precisely. The critique suggests there's a misplaced priority, an obsession, you could say, with hearing from what are deemed diverse voices that has started to overshadow the essential craft of telling genuinely good stories.
Stories with universal moral stakes.
Exactly. The critical flaw, according to this analysis, is the assumption that achieving identity-based representation and crafting a morally resonant, deep story that they're automatically the same thing.
And the source material is arguing they are not the same thing at all.
Not at all. And if you decouple those two ideas, the narrative priorities immediately shift. When representation becomes the paramount goal, objective morality, the idea that certain actions carry universal weight, regardless of who commits them,
right.
That idea is often substituted entirely for what we can call sympathetic framing. The story moves away from judging what the character does and instead focuses intently on who the character is.
Or the tragic circumstances that supposedly explain their actions.
That's a huge part of it.
So if we follow this logic, this shift towards sympathetic framing leads directly to the first major structural critique in the loss of accountability, where a character's identity essentially acts as a moral prophylactic. It's a very provocative argument, and the sources use some extreme examples to make their case about what happened.
Precisely. Let's look at the arguments surrounding the film Amelia Perez, which the source really uses as a lightning rod for this whole discussion.
Okay.
The critique targets this narrative approach, right? It tells the story of a former Mexican cartel leader who transitions from male to female. Now, we have to be clear. We are just relaying the argument in the source.
Of course.
The source material argues that once this character achieves what the creators seem to view as, and I'm quoting here, the holy grail of transgenderism, the narrative itself, the story's moral framework, immediately absolves her of her numerous sins.
Wow. That concept, immediate narrative absolution, that's powerful and frankly pretty jarring.
It is.
So if we analyze the structure as it's presented here, the transition functions as a kind of narrative get-out-of-jail-free card.
That's the argument. It grants the character a blank slate.
So why does the source suggest this erases accountability for past actions? I mean, we're talking about leading a cartel, which is unimaginable.
Because in this specific progressive framework being critiqued, the subsequent identity and the character's perceived victimhood, it trumps any prior history.
It's more important than anything they did before.
Yes, the trauma or the identity struggle is presented as being so powerful that it completely overrides the need for true moral reckoning or, earned redemption. The past and all the evil acts associated with it are just wiped clean.
Freeing the character to live without facing consequences from the world or even from the story itself.
Exactly.
But wait a minute, isn't having a complex or tragic backstory essential for generating audience empathy? I mean, we see that in nearly every great hero narrative, from Batman to Frodo.
Of course.
So why does the source suggest that the modern framing of trauma or identity is uniquely destructive to the narrative? Why does it create this moral shield?
Because the tragic past is no longer used to explain why a character must struggle or seek atonement.
Okay.
It's used to explain why they can't be held responsible at all. The source material really emphasizes that this storytelling choice leverages identity to bypass moral scrutiny completely.
So it's a shortcut.
It's a shortcut that sets up a paradigm where certain identity milestones are functionally superior to universally accepted moral principles, and that removes the rich narrative tension that you get from accountability and this struggle for redemption.
And it's not just historical criminal acts that get this treatment. The source argues it extends to political violence as well. This brings us to the reception of films about violent revolution.
Yeah, the critique specifically points to the celebration of movies like One Battle After Another, which focuses on a group called the French 75, described here as a far-left revolutionary group.
Right.
And the source observed that despite the group's actions leading to, and I'm quoting, the death, destruction, and injury of innocent people, films like this are often lauded at award ceremonies precisely for their progressivism.
That distinction is so important for understanding. The characters' actions aren't being judged by their objective, the fact that they caused death. They're being viewed through the lens of power dynamic and honor.
Exact. The narrative focus shifts entirely from the objective, often horrifying outcome of the actions to the subjective, internal justification for those acts.
So the questions the film asks are different.
Completely different. Was the character fighting against a perceived oppressive structure? Was the character expressing profound personal autonomy? Yes.
And if the answer is yes,
then the source claims that their morality is framed as inherently justifiable, regardless of the blood spill. The struggle itself becomes the moral virtue, and it overrides the resulting destruction.
So this analysis all comes together into what the critique terms a very specific and troubling new moral paradigm in modern storytelling.
Yeah.
It's a morality that's entirely tied to external facts, socioeconomic status, identity, past suffering, rather than the character's actual choice present.
And we can break this new paradigm down into 3 core pillars that the source material identifies.
Okay, let's hear them.
First, economic status. If a character belongs to a low tax bracket, or is economically disadvantaged, they are automatically positioned as sympathetic.
So their goodness, or at least the forgiveness for their bad deeds, is sort of presumed just because of their economic standing.
Pretty much. Second, the tragic backstory becomes the narrative skeleton key.
Right.
If a character has suffered trauma, the source claims that, and this is a direct quote, any preceding actions that they commit cannot be held against them.
That's a huge claim. The past trauma becomes a narrative permission slip for immorality or amorality in the present.
The suffering itself is treated as the ultimate moral defense. It just eliminates the need for present-day moral choice.
Okay, and the third pillar?
The third pillar ties directly back to our initial point. If a character belongs to any of the diverse groups that Hollywood consistently panders to, their morality and the morality of their actions become unquestionable within the narrative structure.
Which completes the whole skin-deep approach. Representation is prioritized to the point where it excuses narrative rigor and moral struggle.
That's the argument.
So let's talk about the immediate consequences for you, the audience. If you're watching stories built on this framework, where are the structural elements you expect from a great story? Things like consequences, truth, genuine transformation.
Well, the source material argues those elements are almost entirely absent, and that leaves the audience feeling, unsatisfied.
Because they're expecting.
They expect accountability, they expect an objective moral center, and they expect the possibility of earned redemption. And these elements are often structurally impossible within these new narratives.
Okay, let's break that down. Why does accountability, if morality is based on those external factors, identity, low economic stat, why does the need for consequence vanish?
Because if the character is deemed morally justified by their identity or their tragic past, then the story has already defined them as having done nothing wrong. They are acting within the boundaries established by the injustice done. So if there's no wrong committed from a structural stamp, there's no need for accountability. And the narrative tension it collapses.
And objective truth is collateral damage.
Absolute. Because, as the source states, truth now applies individually across the board. If morality is subjective to the character's lived experience and identity, then truth has to be subjective too.
which makes it impossible for the audience to connect with the universal moral framework inside the story. Everything is relative.
And finally, redemption is rendered obsolete.
Why?
Because the source argues that the past is always erased for these characters, no matter how heinous it is. If the past is automatically absolved, like the critique suggests happens in that Emilia Perez example, then there's no journey toward redemption required.
There's no work to be done.
None. There is only instant absolution or justice.
So if these characters operate without consequence, without reflection, without any need for atonement, what kind of character archetype does this new paradigm even create?
It creates the archetype described as the perpetual victim.
The perpetual.
Yeah, they may accumulate power, they may take everything they want, they may even commit terrible acts, yet the narrative relentlessly frames them as oppressed or victimized by external forces.
And the key narrative failure here, according to the source, is trust.
Trust. Exactly. The audience cannot trust these characters because the story tells us they will always be looking out for themselves and no one else.
They're static figures. They're never forced into the necessary reflection or introspection that would cast their actions in a new light.
Right. They are never truly affected by their choices because the narrative structure refuses to allow them.
And this is why the source material concludes that this genre of storytelling, the one focused entirely on the self and individual autonomy without consequence, will always be viewed as small, and insignificant.
Unworthy of being considered a great story.
Because it lacks that universal moral struggle, the weight of consequence, and the possibility of genuine transformation that allows stories to resonate across time and culture. It's narrow. It's focused only on the individual's desires.
Okay, so if that's the negative case, the contraction of a story through selfishness and a lack of consequence, we need a strong example of the opposite effect. And this brings us beautifully to a powerful counterexample, the recent film Godzilla -1. Our source describes it as a refreshing original story set immediately after Japan's defeat in World War II.
And the success of this film, especially its global resonance, really proves the source's point about audience hunger.
How so?
It succeeded precisely because it did what the critique argues modern stories failed. It acknowledged the true, crushing, painful cost that war and devastation demand from people. It didn't shy away from the psychological and moral toll.
That is such a vital observation when you think about the standard blockbuster, right? Conflict in modern cinema is usually just framed as an opportunity for glory.
Yeah, a showcase.
It's a chance for characters to demonstrate their unique, often pre-existing skills, or just an excuse for a massive CGI spectacle. It treats conflict as a transactional event, danger in, power out. But Godzilla -1, it anchors its terror in the psychological wreckage of post-war Japan. It focuses on the painful realities and the enduring suffering of the characters.
And without that commitment to showing the psychological toll and the human cost.
The source argues that stories do not have nearly as much weight. It's the difference between just seeing a fight and truly feeling a sacrifice.
So let's get into the specifics of that cost. What exactly does the source highlight that the film shows war takes from those survivors?
Well, the source provides a really devastating list. It says war takes a person's fundamental humanity.
Okay.
Their physical health, their capacity for compassion, their life's purpose, or often their sanity. And it's the sanity that is utterly destroyed through PTSD, pervasive grief, and survivor's guilt.
Wounds that are often, overlooked or sterilized in contemporary action cinema.
Completely. And this is where the main character, Koichi Shikishima, provides such profound depth. His portrayal isn't just a convenient plot device to introduce a monster movie. It's an exploration of deep psychological wounds that he is trying and failing to manage.
So we see him grappling with significant debilitating.
Yes, and this is compounded by profound grief, not just for the loss of his parents, but also the deep, almost unbearable guilt he carries for simply surviving the war.
Because he believes he failed his duty as a kamikaze pilot.
And is responsible for the deaths of his comrades. He is psychologically shattered before Godzilla ever even appears on screen.
The narrative commitment to this is so deep that, as the critique points out, he doesn't come back whole.
Not at all. He is sometimes wrapped in the throes of delusion, questioning his entire reality. He's not sure if he has survived or if he has just postponed his death.
So Godzilla's return isn't just a physical threat to Tokyo.
No, it's a living manifestation of his internal guilt. It's his refusal to face the past made real and monstrous.
And this commitment to showing the psychological toll, it gives the story an essential universe.
It elevates the conflict beyond a simple battle. When Koichi eventually chooses to act, the audience understands the immense internal struggle, the psychological gravity, and the personal sacrifice required for him to overcome his guilt and embrace a selfless, heroic action.
So his virtue is earned.
It's earned, not simply displayed. And that makes his heroism genuinely resonant, unlike the low-stakes, consequence-free heroism we often see.
It's a really powerful narrative contrast, isn't it? In the self-autonomy narrative, the character is justified for everything they do based on their past trauma. But in the Godzilla -1 example, the main character is completely paralyzed by his trauma, and his heroism only emerges when he chooses to overcome that trauma in service of others.
That's the key difference. One uses trauma as an excuse, the other presents it as an obstacle to be overcome through virtue.
Okay, so we've established the negative consequences of a small, selfish story. Now we can move to the positive argument. Why do virtuous characters stand the test of time, and why should storytellers embrace them? The first major reason our sources highlight is narrative expansion.
This is a cornerstone of the critique. The principle is simple yet profound.
Go on.
Just as non-virtuous, selfish characters contract a story down to a singular, desperate point, their individual desire, like Gollum in The Ring,
Right.
virtuous actions open up story possibility. They prolong the narrative life because of the alliances, loyalties, and complex connections they build.
So selfishness limits, self-sacrifice expands.
That's it, in a nutshell.
And when you talk about stories expanded by virtue and the refusal of power, I mean, there is truly no better example than the Lord of the Rings trilogy.
None. The entire plot is predicated on the deliberate choice to deny immense power.
Yes.
The focus here is on the concept of refusal. Our sources highlight 3 prominent characters who were tested, who had the ring of power within their grasp, and who consciously chose to reject it for the sake of Middle-earth.
And these 3 refusals, Gandalf, Aragorn, and Faramir, they're not just moral moments, are they?
No, they are plot mechanics. They are the very things that keep the story alive.
Okay, let's start with Gandalf. The moment he is offered the ring in Bag End, he recoils. He refuses to even touch it, declaring the power would be too great for him. So what are the narrative consequences if he had failed that test, if he had taken the ring?
Well, the source argues that if Gandalf, despite his desire to do good and organize the forces of light, had succumbed and taken the ring, his use of it would have immediately made him another Sauron.
A dark lord with good intentions.
Exactly. A dark lord driven by the ring's inherent corruption. And the story, critically, would have been over within the Fellowship of the Ring.
It would have been a quick, destructive, and ultimately very cynical.
Complete.
So his refusal is the narrative. Because he rejects the power, the immense burden must fall to a small, humble figure, Frodo, which fundamentally dictates the entire course of the next 2,000 stories.
Yes. His virtue is the engine that prolongs the entire saga. It leads to the necessary alliances and the epic journey.
Think about it. The story is structurally impossible otherwise.
It is. A power-corrupted Gandalf would immediately centralize the war, probably destroying Sauron quickly, but leaving Middle-earth under a different, equally terrible tyranny. His self-denial protects Frodo, it maintains the Fellowship's moral compass, and it allows the various realms to rise up independently rather than being controlled by a single terrifying figure.
And then there's Aragorn, the rightful king of Gondor, haunted by the past failures of his ancestors.
A man who actively ran from power for decades.
He ran from it. The ring tests him repeatedly, but he remains steadfast in his denial. Why is his virtue essential for narrative expansion?
Well, the source material reminds us that power was never something the Ranger truly wanted. His virtue is rooted in his grief, his humility, and his fear of repeating Isildur's failure.
So his commitment is not to the throne.
No, it's to the protection of others, even if it meant dying as a humble ranger. His refusal of the ring confirms that his claim to the throne is based on service, not on ambition.
And that commitment expands the narrative by attracting loyalty. Because he is self-sacrificial and humble, he draws key figures.
Legolas, Gimli, the armies of the dead.
And eventually, the people of Gondor. He becomes a king and a man worth following. His earned virtue creates an entire structure of loyalty that is absolutely essential for the political and military climax of the story.
And we can't forget Faramir, Boromir's younger brother.
Right.
His encounter with the ring is a quieter but equally profound test of virtue. Boromir, driven by patriotic desperation for Gondor, wanted to use the ring for power. Faramir, though just as loyal to his people, recognizes the truth and chooses to allow Frodo and Sam to pass unmolested into Mordor.
A choice that, if he'd made it differently, would have ended everything. If Faramir had taken the ring back to his father, Denethor, a man already teetering on madness and obsession,
the quest would have failed immediately. Faramir's virtue, his simple recognition that the ring cannot be used for good, secures the passage of the protagonist. His refusal is another essential plot point that keeps the narrative moving forward.
It proves that virtue isn't just for the grand heroes, but for the moral strength of secondary characters.
Had any of these 3, Gandalf, Aragorn, or Faramir, taken the ring, the narrative expansion just stops dead. The entire hope of Middle-earth is tied up in humility, the restraint, and the self-denial.
Their choice to not control is the choice that creates story.
Perfectly put.
And to really solidify this point about expansion versus contraction, the source contrasts those heroes with the exact opposite, Gollum.
The embodiment of singular selfish desire.
Yes.
Gollum serves as the perfect narrative demonstration of contraction. His very first act upon encountering the ring was murder.
And then he possessed the ring for 500 years, letting it poison his mind to everything except pure self.
His life just narrows down to one single, lusting after the ring, ignoring even the basic needs of survival. He existed solely for his prey.
The result is just pure focused malice. He plans murder, displays no remorse, and is only concerned with his singular, desperate goal.
And while Gollum plays a necessary role in the story's climax, the source notes that his selfishness limits his character potential entirely.
You don't root for.
The audience has no desire for him to be saved or redeemed because he has extinguished that possibility through 500 years of self-service. His story is entirely one-dimensional, unremarkable in its ultimate selfishness, and therefore it contracts the story to a singular, desperate objective.
So the lesson is clear. Virtuous characters prolong the life of a story because they build connections and alliances that create complex webs of loyalty and conflict, expanding.
While selfish characters, concerned only with their own desires, ignore others unless they are convenient, making the overall narrative small, disposable, and, easily forgotten. Okay, so moving beyond the structural benefits of narrative expansion, the second crucial reason virtuous characters are essential is, well, it's simply the power of value. They provide genuine, lasting inspirations.
And the source argues that characters who are battered, who are broken down by challenges, but who still strive to do the right thing, protecting the vulnerable, facing down their inner demons, they are fundamentally more interesting than those whose only goal is fame or power or...
It's the difference between a character defined by the external metrics of success and one defined by internal honor, bravery, and perseverance.
Yeah.
It is those enduring, morally rich characters, the ones who make the tough, self-sacrificial choice, that are truly memorable and aspirational. #, quiet strength, Hacksaw Ridge.
Our sources immediately point to the 2014 portrayal of Desmond Doss in Hacksaw Ridge as a prime example of this quiet yet indomitable strength.
Yeah, that film really resonated. It resonated because it showcased not just the physical horrors of war, which connects back to our discussion of Godzilla -1,
Right.
but the indomitable will of the human spirit.
Yeah.
Doss was a conscientious objector, ridiculed and persecuted by his peers and officers for refusing to carry a weapon.
Yeah.
Yet he possessed a strength they all lacked.
He was slight and unassuming, but his strength was internal and absolute. The source specifically mentions his prayers for deliverance and strength while dragging injured men off the ridge as just hair-raising moments of pure commitment to his moral values.
It's the spiritual struggle that gives the action weight.
Good.
And this commitment, it transcended his personal belief system to become a universal inspiration. His values served as an ethical beacon, not just to the audience, but to his fellow soldiers and his commanders.
His unwavering willingness to save every single person he could, despite having been wronged and persecuted by those very officers earlier in the film, it makes him a figure of immense, unselfish moral authority.
He risked his life repeatedly for men who had tried to break him.
Yeah. His actions were not motivated by external glory or rank or personal gain. They were purely motivated by an internal, unselfish commitment to saving lives.
That is virtue in action. It provides a clear model of aspiration for the viewer.
And we find a more contemporary example of value in Top Gun, Maverick.
The source highlights the dynamic between Maverick and Rooster, which is complex and layered due to that shared history and trauma.
They start the film as oil and water, right? Driven by a deep, unresolved conflict stemming from Goose's death.
Absolutely.
Yet despite the anger and the underlying tension, the core virtuous action shines through when the stakes are at their highest.
Yes. The source material emphasizes that when the chips were down, they didn't continue their squabble for self-gain or to prove who was the better pilot. They acted immediately to save each other.
No matter the personal cost or risk of failure, this demonstrated profound cooperation.
It did.
And why is that specific moment so important in the context of...
Because it is such a refreshing contrast to the modern focus on characters who only seek individual power and recognition. I mean, while collaboration is Navy 101, it is becoming increasingly rare to see characters on screen demonstrating genuinely unselfish interdependence.
Right.
They were willing to sacrifice their individual glory, their aircraft, and potentially their lives for the mutual safety of the other. That commitment to another human being's well-being over personal advancement.
It's the definition of the virtue audiences are starving for.
That's what the source claims. #, the decline of on.
And this brings us to a more cynical observation from the source. If we look across the current media landscape, the argument is that inspiration
Dying.
Yeah. The best quality of any truly timeless character, their ability to spark awe and wonder in us, is fading.
And that awe and wonder, it comes from the perception that the character is acting for something greater than themselves, whether it's how they protect others, the values they live by, the odds they overcome, or the personal struggles they master. That spark is being extinguished, according to the critique, because the primary generators of cinematic inspiration are faltering.
And here we have to look at the Marvel Cinematic Universe, the MCU. For years, they were the undisputed leaders in creating inspirational characters, especially with the original Avengers lineup.
For sure.
But the source claims that in the last few years, their collection of inspirational figures has all but dried up.
Or the few that retain those inspirational qualities have been actively sidelined or significantly altered.
Yes.
And the current ethos of the superhero narrative, according to this critique, has devolved into one where every character is out for their own gain at this point.
And that's the definition of the self-serving, small storytelling we discussed in the first section.
It is. If every hero is prioritizing personal gain, or if their actions are primarily transactional, done only to secure their own future or peace, where is the genuine awe in their sacrifice?
Why should we look up to them if they are just as self as anyone else?
That cynicism feeds itself, doesn't it?
It does. If the heroes are cynical about virtue, the audience quickly becomes cynical about these.
Exactly. And the critique extends this observation to the DC universe as well. The source cites observations about the most recent Superman film, noting that he was fundamentally unable to be presented as an entirely inspirational figure.
And this wasn't just because the plot forced him to be a punching bag throughout.
No, it was also because almost no one else in the film respected him either.
And that lack of internal respect is a death blow to the awe factor. A hero's power comes not just from their physical strength, but from the moral. If even the characters within the story don't look up to the hero, if they treat him as an annoyance or necessary, why should the audience invest in him as an aspirational figure?
The DC universe, the source claimed, now seems to be dominated by snarky and irreverent characters who just undermine the very concept of sincerity and nobility.
Which leads to the source's profound suspicion that Hollywood, or at least the mainstream blockbuster machine, has forgotten or actively suppressed how to write genuinely inspirational characters.
They are struggling to define virtue in a way that is compelling without being cynical.
And the evidence they provide for this difficulty is it's pretty striking. They reference a specific quote from director James Gunn, who reportedly said that he couldn't crack the character of Superman until the element that was Crypto, the dog, was brought in.
Yeah. And that statement, according to the source, it speaks volumes about Hollywood's current narrative paralysis.
How so?
If a creative team needs to rely on an extraneous sidekick element, in this case Superman's dog, to make the core character work, it suggests a profound loss of ability to define inspiration based purely on the inherent virtue or the moral struggle or the self-sacrifice of the character himself.
They can't find the virtue in the human or Kryptonian element. They need a sentimental crutch.
They've substituted inherent nobility with situational sentimentality.
And this inability is why films that do manage to capture that spark of self-sacrificial virtue are seeing enormous success, reinforcing the source's argument about audience demand.
Yes, they mentioned Godzilla -1 and also the success of things like K-pop Demon Hunters media that resonated deeply because they offered something fundamentally different than the current cynical standard.
They offered clear, unambiguous aspiration. #outro.
So the ultimate takeaway from this comprehensive critique is, well, I think it's undeniable. Virtuous characters are not merely a quaint traditional element of storytelling. They are the bedrock of lasting, profitable, and meaningful.
And the commercial and cultural appeal of truly virtuous characters is their longevity. I mean, they are still being referenced decades after their creation. Their words are quoted constantly in common parlance. Their stories are rewatched relentlessly. And crucially, they generate astronomical profit margins.
The audience's demand for aspiration is a clear, proven market reality.
The source material insists that people are starving for characters that are authentic, real, and aspirational.
Yeah, we need heroes and figures that we can genuinely look up to, strive to be like, and connect with on a fundamental, universal moral level.
Yeah.
Characters who choose self-sacrifice over self-gain.
And here is the warning the sources issue to the industry. If Hollywood continues to offer what they term a twisted form of virtue masquerading as hedonism, stories where selfishness is excused by identity and autonomy replaces accountability, they will continue to bleed profits, lose fans, and sacrifice their relevancy altogether.
And the source believes they are dangerously close to the point of no return as it is.
That's a dire warning.
It is. And the success stories, like Godzilla -1, are direct proof. The market reality shows that if Hollywood refuses to provide virtuous, inspirational figures to the audience will go elsewhere to someone who can.
The audience is actively seeking narrative morality and will vote with their wallets when they find it.
That's a powerful, market-driven conclusion, that the hunger for heroes who make genuinely self-sacrificing choices is not just a moral argument, but an economic imperative. And this leads us to our final thought. If the greatest stories are those that are expanded and deepened by self-sacrifice, accountability, and true human connection, what cultural implications exist when our primary fictional figures increasingly define virtue purely by individual gain and autonomy?
And when past sins are simply erased rather than atoned for.
Exactly. We are left with a culture that perhaps struggles to define heroism outside the boundaries of the self. That is definitely something for you to chew on as you watch your next movie or series.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We'll see you next time.